Keanu Reeves stepped into his abandoned childhood home expecting nostalgia. Instead, he found a single loose floorboard and a hidden box that made his hands tremble. Inside was something left for him decades ago, something tied to the night that changed his life forever. And the moment he opened it, everything he thought he knew collapsed. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The house was silent when Keanu stepped inside. The kind of silence that presses against the skin and makes every memory feel heavier. Dust drifted through the air like slow-falling snow, catching the faint winter light that slipped through the cracked front window. He stood completely still for a moment, letting the weight of the place settle on him. It had been more than 4 decades since he last walked through this doorway, yet everything in his body reacted as if no time had passed at all. The floor creaked under his boots, an old familiar sound that pulled something deep from the back of his mind. The air smelled of cold wood, forgotten rooms, and a loneliness he remembered too well. He scanned the empty space. The walls were bare, the paint peeling in long strips. A single doorframe still held the faded pencil marks measuring his height as a child. His name written in uneven letters sat next to the lowest one. He traced it lightly with his thumb. The house felt abandoned, but it also felt like it had been waiting for him. He took a slow step forward, then another. The center of the living room held a patch of floorboards that looked worn and slightly darker than the rest, as if someone had stepped on that exact spot thousands of times. When he stepped on it, it shifted under his weight. A soft click echoed through the empty room. He froze. He pressed down again. The same sound answered him. He knelt beside it, brushing away dust with the back of his hand. One board sat just slightly higher than the others, barely noticeable unless you knew this room the way he once had. His heart tightened. A memory tried to surface. Smoke, shouting, someone pulling his hand, a night he could never fully remember no matter how hard he tried. He slid his fingers beneath the edge of the loose board. The wood resisted at first, swollen with age, but after a gentle pull, it lifted with a groan. Beneath it lay a narrow hollow cut into the floor itself. Light from the window revealed the edge of something inside. Something carefully placed, something that did not belong to an empty house. Keanu stared at it, unable to breathe for a moment. Time seemed to stop stretching thin in the cold air. His voice broke in a whisper he did not expect, a whisper pulled from a part of him he rarely touched. After all these years, why didn't anyone tell me? The hollow beneath the board seemed impossibly small, yet the sight of it hit him with the force of a memory he could not fully grasp. Keanu lowered himself onto one knee, the cold wood pressing through his jeans as he leaned closer. The edges of the hidden space were lined with thin cracks, as though someone had carved it out in a hurry or with trembling hands. A faint scent of aged paper drifted upward. It smelled untouched, sealed away from the world for longer than he had been famous, maybe even longer than he had been grown. He hesitated before reaching in. Something inside him pulled back a warning from a part of his past that had always resisted being opened. For years he had learned to live with blurred pieces of childhood fragments that appeared and vanished without explanation. Toronto had been a place of motion, not stability. Apartments, rooms, temporary walls. But this house, this one carried a different weight. He had lived here long enough to form attachments, long enough to lose them too. His fingertips brushed against an object wrapped in fabric. The cloth crumbled slightly at his touch. He lifted it carefully, bringing it into the light. It wasn't just any fabric. It looked like part of an old shirt torn around the edges, the cotton thinned with time. Inside the folded cloth was something rigid. He unfolded one corner and found a small wooden toy carved crudely but lovingly. A toy sword no longer than his hand. A pulse of warmth moved through his chest. He recognized it. He remembered holding it in the yard, swinging it at imaginary foes while someone laughed beside him. A boy's laughter, not his own. Someone braver than him. Someone who used to promise they'd always watch out for each other. The name formed in his mind like a soft echo. Lucas. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in decades. He wasn't sure he could now. The memory of the boy who had been his closest friend felt distant and fragile, as though reaching for it too quickly might shatter it entirely. He set the toy aside and reached back into the hollow. His fingers found paper, more than one sheet folded tightly together. As he lifted them out, he noticed the edges were uneven, some torn, others burned. A chill ran through him. These weren't just notes. They looked like pieces of something official, something that once belonged to the police. Keanu stared at the torn papers in his hands, a sense of dread blooming slowly inside him. Someone had hidden these. Someone had made sure they stayed buried here, waiting for him to return. But why? Keanu held the torn papers, as if they might crumble with one more breath. The ink had faded into soft gray streaks, but he could still make out fragments. Dates, times, an address he recognized even before his mind allowed him to acknowledge it. It was this house, this exact living room, a report of an emergency, a disturbance, a child involved. His pulse thudded in his ears. He forced himself to read the next torn line, even as something inside him begged him to stop. The report mentioned 2 minors found on the property, one identified, one taken away. The words blurred for a moment as the house around him seemed to tilt. Something terrible had happened here, something far more complicated than the scattered memories he carried. He reached back into the hollow. His hand brushed against one more object, a folded photograph. He opened it slowly, letting the dim light reveal the image. 2 boys sat cross-legged on the front porch, both holding wooden swords and grinning at the camera. One was unmistakably him, hair messy, eyes bright. The other was the same boy from his memory, Lucas. His arm was draped across Keanu's shoulders, protective even in the photograph. Keanu felt his chest tighten. The picture wasn't dated, but he could sense the frozen moment of innocence trapped inside it. It was taken before everything shifted, before the night he could never remember clearly. The night Lucas vanished from his life. He lowered the photo, his breath visible in the cold air. The truth wasn't just buried in this house. It had been buried inside him, sealed under the floorboards like a time capsule of pain and unanswered questions. He whispered the same words again, but softer this time, as if speaking to the ghosts in the room. After all these years, why didn't anyone tell me? The final day of filming in New York should have felt triumphant. Cast and crew gathered around monitors, trading stories, celebrating the wrap of another demanding project. Keanu gave the familiar, quiet smile, shook hands, and offered gratitude, the way he always did. But beneath the surface, something in him felt unsettled, as though a thin thread inside his chest had been pulled tight without warning. He pushed the feeling aside, assuming it was exhaustion, yet it lingered long after he returned to his hotel room overlooking the Hudson River. He found the letter waiting for him on the small table by the door. No return address, no markings. The envelope was worn, edges softened by travel, as if it had passed through too many hands before reaching him. His name was written in shaky cursive, almost hesitant. The irregular strokes suggested an older writer, someone fighting against unsteady fingers. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Inside lay a single photograph, small and faded. He recognized the boy instantly, a 5-year-old version of himself, hair sticking out in wild directions, standing barefoot on a summer porch. The house behind him was unmistakable. The Toronto home he had just stood in for the first time in decades. The porch where he and Lucas once played for hours. A chill crept up his spine. Something about the image felt off, though he couldn't explain why. The back of the photograph held only one sentence, written in the same trembling handwriting as the envelope. "You should come home, Keanu, before it's too late." No signature, no clue to its origin. Just a warning that sounded less like a suggestion and more like a plea. He stared at the words, a knot forming in his stomach. He tried to brush it off as a strange coincidence, maybe a fan who somehow gained access to old family pictures. but the handwriting didn't feel like a stranger's. There was an intimacy to it, a kind of urgency that carried weight. He turned the photograph over again, studying the porch behind his young self, the cracked railing, the leaning post, the dark spot near the steps. He remembered the house, but the details tugged at him in ways he couldn't name, as if the porch was holding a memory just beyond his reach. Something was wrong with this picture, and he felt it in every part of his chest. Keanu set the photograph down on the bedside table, but it felt impossible to leave it alone. His eyes kept drifting back to it, drawn by a tension he couldn't describe. The message on the back echoed in his mind, quiet but insistent. He tried to distract himself by packing, by answering emails, by listening to music the way he always did after a long shoot. None of it worked. The letter had cracked open a door he didn't realize still existed inside him. He sat in the dim room, the soft glow from a reading lamp casting long shadows along the walls. Memories he had locked away began to surface. Moving from one apartment to another, hearing adults argue behind closed doors, watching his mother try her best despite circumstances far beyond her control, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, brief flashes of stability in a house that never truly belonged to them but held a small piece of safety. The house in Toronto. The house in the photograph. He remembered running through its hallways with bare feet, the floorboards cool against his skin. He remembered playing on the porch steps until the sun dipped low behind the trees. He remembered Lucas, the friend who felt like a brother, the boy who filled his days with courage and laughter. But he also remembered the night everything changed. A night swallowed by smoke shouts and a silence that lasted for years. He picked up the photograph again, holding it closer to the light. The porch boards behind the little boy seemed uneven in a way that triggered something faint, something buried. He couldn't shake the sensation that whoever sent this photo wanted him to look at more than just his childhood smile. They wanted him to look at the place itself, at what happened there, at what he had forgotten. The unease in his chest grew sharper. He checked the envelope again, hoping for an overlooked clue. Nothing. No return address, no postal code. It looked hand-delivered, as though someone had walked it to a mailbox, with a purpose only they understood. Most people would dismiss it as a strange fan gesture, but Keanu knew better. He had felt this kind of pull before. The quiet sense that something from the past was calling him back, not to haunt him, but to answer a question he didn't yet know how to ask. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the lights along the river. He felt a heaviness mixed with a sense of direction. A quiet truth settled into his bones. He needed to go home. Keanu didn't book a flight right away. He placed the photograph back into the envelope and set it on the table as if giving himself space to breathe. But that quiet moment only made the tension stronger. The room seemed to shrink around him. The air felt heavier, filled with the weight of everything he had left behind in Toronto without meaning to. Childhood wasn't something he often revisited, not because it lacked value, but because it held wounds that never fully closed. The letter had reopened one of them. By morning, he still hadn't slept. He walked through the hotel lobby before sunrise wearing a dark hoodie and carrying only a small bag. The city outside was quiet, the streets still wet from a light overnight rain. A car service waited for him arranged hours earlier in a moment of restless clarity. He didn't tell his team where he was going. He didn't tell friends either. This wasn't a trip for explanations or meetings. It was something he needed to face alone. At the airport, he kept his head low. Even in the early hours, someone always recognized him. But today, he moved like a shadow. The plane ticket he purchased was simple. One way, direct to Toronto. No return date. The clerk didn't ask questions when he slid his passport across the counter. He appreciated that silence more than he knew how to express. On the flight, he rested his forehead against the window. Clouds drifted beneath him like rolling fields of white. He held the photograph in his hand, unable to put it away. The little boy staring back at him seemed so unaware of what was coming, so unaware of how quickly innocence could fracture. He wondered who had taken the picture. He wondered who had kept it all these years, and he wondered why they waited until now to send it. Before it's too late. Those words repeated in his mind like a soft drumbeat. Too late for what? Too late to repair a memory. Too late to confront a truth buried under time. Too late to reach someone he had once cared about more than he realized. The plane descended through gray clouds, revealing the familiar skyline in the distance. The moment the wheels touched down, a strange calm washed over him. Not relief, not dread, something in between, something like acceptance. He picked up his bag, tucked the envelope safely inside, and stepped onto the cold Toronto air. There were no cameras, no entourage, just the quiet of a city he once knew and a feeling deep in his chest that he was exactly where he needed to be. He headed straight for the rental car lot, gripping the wheel with steady hands. It was time to go home. The drive from the airport took him along familiar streets that had changed just enough to feel strange. Buildings were newer, traffic heavier, but every now and then a glimpse of an old storefront or a park bench tugged at something inside him. As he approached the neighborhood where he spent some of his earliest years, the air seemed to shift. The houses were closer together here, old but sturdy, lined with tall maple trees that creaked in the wind. He slowed the car as he turned onto the narrow street he had not seen since childhood. The moment he entered the block, memories came without warning. Children chasing each other along sidewalks, the echo of laughter that wasn't always his, the slam of front doors during arguments that bled through thin walls, the quiet dread of opening an empty refrigerator at night, knowing he wouldn't complain because someone else was already struggling. He remembered sitting on the curb with neighborhood kids sharing crackers and stories and pretending none of them heard the shouting from inside their own homes. The house appeared at the end of the street, just as he remembered it, and yet not the same. Nature seemed to have claimed it. The paint had peeled away in long curling strips exposing the gray wood beneath. The front porch sagged slightly as if years of storms had bowed it downward. A shutter hung crooked on one hinge. The yard was overgrown brittle leaves, collecting in piles along the walkway. He parked the car and stepped out, feeling the cold air bite at his skin. He walked toward the house slowly, his boots crunching against a thin layer of frost. For a moment he stood still and took in the sight. He felt as though he were staring at a frozen version of his past, preserved in neglect and silence. His heart thudded heavily. This was the place where he once felt both safe and scared sometimes within the same hour. The place where he had learned to entertain himself, to observe quietly, to endure. It held echoes of loneliness, but also flashes of warmth usually found in the company of other children rather than adults. As he reached the bottom of the porch steps, he brushed his hand along the rail. The wood felt brittle, but he could still sense the shape of it, the familiar groove his fingers used to follow when he was small. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the past wash over him. Then he heard a sharp gasp from behind. When he turned, an older woman stood near the fence, staring at him with wide eyes that shone with disbelief. The woman hurried toward him, stopping just a few feet away, as if she needed a second to truly believe what she was seeing. Her hair was streaked with gray, pulled back into a neat bun, and her warm brown eyes softened the moment they met his. He searched her face, unsure at first. Then the memory crystallized. It was her. A familiar presence from the years when adults often felt distant and unpredictable, someone who showed kindness without asking for anything in return. Mrs. Alvarez. He hadn't thought of her in years, but now, standing in front of the house where so much had happened, her presence grounded him in a way he didn't expect. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her breath unsteady. She looked as though she were seeing not the man standing before her, but the little boy he once was. The boy she used to watch when the world inside this house became too loud, too chaotic, or too lonely. She moved closer, her expression full of emotion. Her voice was soft, almost disbelieving as she greeted him by the name only someone from this street would dare to use. It wasn't the name known to the world. It was the name of a child who once sat at her kitchen table, with scraped knees and quiet eyes. Hearing it again sent a tremor through him. Memories rose like gentle waves, bitter-sweet and heavy. She reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently touching his arm as if making sure he was truly real. She asked how long he had been back, but he could only shake his head, slightly overwhelmed by the moment. The years had been kind to her, though the lines on her face hinted at hardships he never knew she faced. Her kindness, however, remained unchanged. She looked past him toward the house, and her expression shifted. The warmth in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something deeper, a sadness mixed with caution. She whispered that the owner of the house had passed away only a week earlier. The news settled in his chest like a weight. Even though he had no reason to expect the man to still be alive, hearing it brought an unexpected pang of loss. Another thread to his past had been cut before he could touch it. Mrs. Alvarez glanced back at him with a seriousness he hadn't seen from her before. She told him she had things to say, things he deserved to hear. But not yet. Not out here. She insisted he go inside first, that the house itself would speak to him before she did. Her words carried a gravity that made his heartbeat quicken. Keanu turned back toward the house, feeling the weight of Mrs. Alvarez's words settle into him like a quiet warning. The porch steps creaked beneath his boots, the same familiar sound he heard as a child, running up and down these boards, pretending this weathered house was a fortress. Now the sound felt hollow, almost fragile, as though the wood carried memories it was tired of holding alone. The front door resisted when he tried the knob swollen from years of weather. He pressed harder, and it finally gave way with a low groan that echoed through the empty rooms. Cold air drifted out to greet him, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and something else he couldn't name. It felt like stepping into a memory, frozen in place. Inside, the silence was thicker. Light filtered through the broken blinds, illuminating particles dancing in the air. The living room was stripped bare, yet he recognized the shape of the space instantly. The corner where he once sat with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, the wall where someone once hung a crooked painting, the spot near the window where he and Lucas played with toy cars until the sun dipped too low to see. As he stepped further inside, memories pressed against him from every angle. He remembered how the refrigerator often held little more than a carton of milk and a few leftovers. How laughter outside always sounded louder because inside was too quiet. He remembered the comfort of being part of the group of neighborhood kids who accepted him without question. Children who understood the unspoken rule that you didn't ask why someone looked sad. You just invited them to play. Yet, beneath the warmth of those memories lay flashes of darker moments. Nights when raised voices shook the hallway. Nights when he closed his eyes tightly, wishing for morning. Nights when Lucas would slip into the house to check on him, telling him stories in a whisper until things calmed down. Keanu walked slowly toward the center of the room, the same direction his feet had carried him decades earlier. He crouched down and lightly brushed his hand along the floorboards, feeling the unevenness beneath his palm. The wood seemed to pulse with something unspoken, as if urging him to look deeper to uncover the truth sealed beneath it. Behind him, through the open door, he sensed Mrs. Alvarez watching from the yard, not intruding, not rushing, simply waiting for the house to speak to him first the way she said it needed to. Keanu stood up, inhaling deeply as he let the atmosphere sink into him. This was where everything began. And now, for reasons he still didn't understand, this was where he was meant to return. Keanu stepped deeper into the house, letting the door fall shut behind him with a dull thud that echoed through the empty rooms. The sound felt final, as if sealing him inside a space untouched by time. He stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet. It wasn't normal quiet. It had a weight to it, the kind that settles into the bones and makes the air feel thick. He took a slow breath, letting the coldness of the room settle on his skin. His eyes traveled along the walls. Faint scribbles still clung to the chipped paint, drawn in the uneven strokes of a child who had been looking for someone to notice his imagination. He remembered the day he made them, a rainy afternoon when adults were too distracted to care, and he had taken a crayon to the living room wall while Lucas urged him to draw something heroic. The shapes were almost erased with time, but he could still recognize the rough outline of a dragon, a shaky star, and a stick figure boy holding a wooden sword. He moved toward the doorway leading to the hall. On the left side of the frame near the baseboard were the height marks he hadn't thought about in decades. Each line was accompanied by a date written in a hurried hand. His name appeared beside a few of them, uneven but earnest. Someone had measured him here, someone who cared enough to track the small milestones, even when life around them was chaotic. His throat tightened as he read the faded numbers. He remembered nights when he felt invisible, but this quiet record proved someone had been paying attention. He walked farther inside, drawn by a pull he didn't entirely understand. In the corner of what once served as a small family room stood a narrow shelf coated in dust. Only one item rested on it, a tiny metal toy car, one wheel missing. The paint was chipped, the once bright red turned dull with time. He reached for it slowly. The moment he touched it, a memory flashed. He had lost it during a game with Lucas. They had searched for it for hours before giving up, convinced it had vanished forever. Now here it was placed neatly, as if someone wanted him to find it. The familiarity of these objects comforted him, but they also unsettled him. Nothing should have remained so perfectly preserved after so many years. The house felt frozen, almost staged, as if someone had intentionally left these pieces of his childhood untouched. He couldn't shake the feeling that every detail was deliberate. Keanu moved toward the small kitchen, each step stirring a faint trail of dust. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, as if it had been untouched even longer. He paused at the threshold. The counters were bare except for a thin layer of grime and a single object placed with impossible precision near the sink. A plastic cup, faded blue, the same kind he used to drink juice from when he was too young to reach the cupboard shelves. He stared at it, struck by how out of place it looked in a room that seemed abandoned decades ago. The refrigerator door hung slightly open, the seal broken. He nudged it with his foot. It creaked loudly, revealing empty shelves coated in dust. The barren interior pulled at an old memory of opening this same door as a boy, hoping for something that wasn't there, closing it again without speaking. He shut it slowly now, feeling that same quiet ache settle deep inside him. Everything in this space felt like a message left behind, not just forgotten clutter. He turned to the counter by the window where faint sunlight filtered through cracked glass. That was when he saw it. Something small, square, and wrapped in a clear plastic pouch that had yellowed with age. It sat alone, centered on the counter as though someone had placed it there intentionally. He stepped closer. The pouch wasn't just any plastic. It was thick with jagged edges and a faded strip of red ink along the top. A tag that had once been bright now hung limp against the side. He recognized the format immediately. It was an old evidence bag, the kind used by police long before digital records replaced physical ones. His breath caught as he leaned in. Inside the bag was a small, carved wooden box. The box was beautifully made despite its size. Smooth edges, a simple pattern etched into the lid. He didn't remember owning anything like it. The sight of it stirred something inside him, a whisper of a memory he couldn't fully grasp. He reached out and rested his fingertips on the plastic, feeling the brittle texture beneath his hand. A sudden heaviness filled the room. The wrongness of the air sharpened. The house no longer felt merely abandoned. It felt curated, as if someone had arranged these remnants to guide him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. He picked up the evidence bag, turning it carefully toward the light. His heart moved in slow, deliberate beats, as though bracing for something buried too deep to name. Behind him, the floorboards creaked gently. Keanu turned slowly toward the sound behind him. Mrs. Alvarez stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face lined with a mixture of worry and sorrow. She looked smaller than he remembered, as though the years had pressed down on her with a weight she could never shake. Yet her eyes held the same gentleness he recalled from childhood, a gentleness that often felt like the only calm in a house filled with noise and uncertainty. She stepped forward hesitantly, her gaze fixed on the evidence bag in his hands. The moment she saw it fully, she inhaled sharply, the reaction subtle but impossible to miss. It was clear she had expected him to find it. Perhaps she had even been waiting for this exact moment. She reached out as if to touch his arm, then stopped herself. The air between them felt tense, as though the house itself was listening. She told him softly not to open the box. Not yet. Her voice trembled with a quiet urgency that unsettled him. She said he needed the full story before he looked inside. The way she spoke made it clear the contents weren't just personal. They were dangerous in the emotional sense, capable of shaking loose memories he had kept dormant for most of his life. Her tone carried the weight of someone who had held a secret far too long. Keanu lowered the bag slowly, his thoughts spiraling around questions he couldn't yet form. He sensed she wasn't trying to shield the truth from him, but to guide him toward it with care. She looked around the room as if the walls held echoes she wished she could silence. She said the house had been untouched for years, that the man who owned it after his family left had lived a lonely, withdrawn life. She mentioned he had been watching over something, though she didn't say what. Her eyes flicked toward the box again, full of meaning she wasn't ready to express. He glanced around the kitchen, suddenly aware of how every object seemed intentionally placed. The toy car on the shelf, the plastic cup, the untouched scribbles, the preserved height marks, all pieces of a childhood he barely remembered arranged with unsettling care. The house felt less like a home and more like a memorial frozen for a purpose he had yet to understand. Mrs. Alvarez rested a hand lightly on the table beside him. She told him she would explain everything, but he needed to be prepared. The truth had been waiting for him longer than he realized. The gravity in her voice made his chest tighten. Keanu looked down at the wooden box through the fogged plastic. A part of him longed to open it immediately, to tear through the mystery without delay. But another part, deeper and older, understood why she stopped him. Whatever was inside had the power to rewrite his past. And before he opened it, he needed to know why someone had protected it all these years. Mrs. Alvarez guided Keanu out of the kitchen and back toward the front door, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she were carefully choosing when and how to share the truth she had carried for so long. The cold air outside felt like a release from the heavy stillness of the house. She motioned toward her home across the street, a small beige house with a narrow porch and potted plants arranged neatly along the steps. It stood in stark contrast to the abandoned structure behind them. Her home looked lived in, warm, and cared for. As they walked, Keanu felt a quiet tightness in his chest. He sensed that whatever she was about to tell him would change everything he thought he knew about his time on this street. The closer they got to her door, the more he felt the weight of years pressing against him. She unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a wave of warmth that met him like a soft embrace. The inside smelled of cinnamon, old books, and lavender, a comforting mix that immediately softened his shoulders. The living room was small, but filled with life. Framed photographs covered every wall. Some were recent, but many were decades old. There were pictures of school plays, street gatherings, neighborhood barbecues, and birthdays celebrated on front lawns. Children smiled from nearly every frame. Some he recognized, some he didn't. But his eyes locked onto one photo in particular, near the center of the wall. A picture of himself at around 7 years old, seated at her kitchen table with a plate of cookies in front of him. His hair was messy, his smile was shy, and his eyes looked calmer than he ever remembered feeling back then. He stepped closer to the photographs, taking in the history she had preserved. Mrs. Alvarez watched him quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She told him she kept these photos because the neighborhood kids had been part of her own family. Many needed a place to go when home wasn't easy, and her door had always been open. He felt a swell of gratitude he didn't know how to express. Her house had been a safe haven he didn't fully understand until now. Her gaze drifted to a framed picture on a side table. It showed a tall man with soft eyes and a thick mustache standing beside her in front of the house. She explained gently that her husband had passed years ago, but before he died, he asked her to keep certain things safe. Things related to Keanu. Things she was finally ready to share. She motioned for him to sit at the small wooden table in her dining area, and her expression grew solemn. It was time to tell him the truth. Keanu sat down at the small table, the wood smooth from years of use. Mrs. Alvarez moved slowly toward a tall cabinet in the corner of the room, one he hadn't noticed before. It was old, made of dark oak, with delicate carvings along the edges. She hesitated before opening it, pressing her palm gently against the door as if gathering strength. When she finally pulled it open, the hinges creaked softly, revealing stacks of shoeboxes, old binders, and a few items wrapped in cloth. She reached for a thin folder worn from age, the corners slightly curled. She placed it on the table in front of him with great care. He felt the heaviness of it even before touching it, as though the papers inside held not just information, but memories thick with emotion. She told him the folder belonged to the man who lived across the street, the same man who owned his childhood home after his family left. His name was Mr. Petrov. The name struck something faint in Keanu's mind, but he couldn't grasp it. She watched his reaction closely, then explained that Petrov wasn't just a landlord who bought the house after his family moved. He had been something more. Someone who watched over the neighborhood quietly. Someone who looked out for children who didn't always have steady parents or predictable nights. And someone who had been there the night Keanu nearly lost his life. Her words made his breath catch. The phrase, "saved your life," echoed in his chest, almost surreal. He opened the folder slowly. Inside were several faded documents, but what drew his eye first was a small photograph. It showed Petrov in his younger years standing beside the porch of the very house he had just walked through. His expression was warm, steady, protective. The kind of presence a frightened child might instinctively trust. Mrs. Alvarez sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. She told him that Petrov had always cared for him even from a distance. He had stepped in more than once when things in the home turned chaotic. He had been the one who checked on the children playing outside when the grown-ups inside were overwhelmed, and on one night, a night filled with shouting and fear, he had been the one who ran into the house to pull Keanu away from danger. Keanu felt a tremor move through him, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of a memory he couldn't fully locate. The image of smoke, the echo of a loud crash, the feeling of a hand grabbing him, rushing him outside into the cold. It came back in fragments too broken to form the entire picture, but she assured him Petrov had kept him alive, even if Keanu had been too young to remember. She said Petrov left things hidden in that house for Keanu's sake, things he felt the boy would need one day when he was old enough to understand, and those things had waited there ever since. Mrs. Alvarez rose from her chair again, moving to the cabinet with a heaviness that suggested she had rehearsed this moment many times, but never imagined it would actually come. From the back of the shelf, she pulled out a flat envelope wrapped in a layer of protective plastic. It had yellowed edges and faint creases as if it had been held often, but opened rarely. She placed it gently in front of him, her expression full of tenderness and caution. She told him this was the last thing Petrov entrusted to her. He had given it to her decades ago, saying only that it belonged to a little boy who would grow into someone strong enough to face the truth. She had never opened it herself, even though the years made her wonder what it contained. She believed it wasn't hers to see. She believed the boy it belonged to would return someday, though she admitted there were many years she doubted that hope. Keanu's hands felt heavier than usual as he lifted the envelope. The paper was soft from age, the writing faint. Inside, he found a single sheet of drawing paper folded neatly into thirds. He opened it slowly, revealing a picture drawn in broad, clumsy strokes with bright crayons. Two boys stood side by side, each holding a wooden sword in the air. One figure had dark hair drawn in thick lines. The other had curly hair sketched in tight loops. A crooked sun hovered above them, smiling. He stared at the drawing for a long moment, breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. He knew this picture. He knew the moment it captured, and he knew the boy who stood beside him, even if he hadn't spoken the name in over 40 years. Lucas? The memory arrived softly at first, like a flicker of warmth on a cold day. Their laughter on summer afternoons, their battles with imaginary monsters, the whispered secrets shared under the porch steps, the promise they made to each other that no matter what happened inside their houses, they would remain a team. He traced the outline of the wooden swords with his thumb. The drawing was childish and imperfect, but it held a truth clearer than anything he had found in the house so far. Mrs. Alvarez watched him with knowing eyes. She told him Lucas had been a constant presence in his early years, a boy with a fierce heart and a protective streak stronger than most adults. She said the two of them had been inseparable, bound in a way only children from difficult homes can understand. Keanu's chest tightened. He hadn't thought of Lucas in decades yet. Seeing his name, his handwriting, and his image in the drawing stirred something deep and painful inside him. Alvarez said this was only the beginning. There was far more he needed to hear. And none of it would be easy. The drawing in his hands opened a door inside Keanu's memory, one that had stayed shut for so long he wasn't sure it would ever open again. But now, with the paper resting lightly between his fingers, the past began to rise like smoke from a long dormant fire. He closed his eyes, letting the image pull him back to a time when the world felt both frightening and magical in equal measure. He remembered the street that had once been his entire universe, the cracked sidewalks where he and Lucas drew chalk kingdoms, the towering maple trees whose branches became watchtowers in their vivid imaginations, the creaky porch steps that doubled as castle walls when they reenacted heroic battles with their wooden swords. Every corner of that neighborhood had held a piece of their childhood, shaping them in ways neither boy could have understood at the time. Lucas had been the brave one, the loud one, the protector. A mixed-race boy with warm brown skin, bright eyes, and a laugh that could cut through even the darkest moments. He lived with his mother in a worn-down apartment a few houses away, their life threaded with struggle, but also fierce love. His mother worked long hours, leaving Lucas alone more often than she wished, but he never complained. Instead, he found comfort in adventure. He made himself the knight of their little world, and Keanu became his loyal fellow warrior. Keanu remembered following him everywhere. Lucas had a way of making even the quietest child feel strong. Together they turned cardboard boxes into fortresses, blankets into capes, sticks into legendary weapons. Their wooden swords were carved from broken fence posts they found behind the house, sanded down carefully by Lucas until the edges were smooth enough for play. They fought imaginary dragons in backyards, hid under porches during grown-up arguments, and whispered dreams of running away someday to a place where no one yelled and no one cried behind closed doors. The days were simple but full. Even in the chaos of their homes, they found safety in each other. Lucas always stood between Keanu and danger, whether it was a barking dog, a rough older kid, or a knight. When the shouting inside Keanu's house grew too loud, Lucas would slip in through the back door without hesitation, sit beside him, and distract him with stories of faraway lands. The memory made Keanu's chest tighten. He had forgotten how much that boy had meant to him, forgotten how deeply he relied on him. But the drawing brought everything back with painful clarity. And with that clarity came the first flicker of something darker. The night that changed everything. A night he could not fully remember, no matter how hard he tried. Keanu held the drawing gently, as if pressing too hard might erase the memories it carried. The details continued returning in fragments, but now they felt sharper, more precise. He remembered the smell of summer grass as he and Lucas rolled through makeshift fortresses, built from cardboard boxes. He remembered how Lucas always took the lead, charging into battles against imaginary enemies with fearless determination. Keanu followed close behind, unsure at times, but unwilling to let his friend face anything alone. Lucas had a presence that made everything feel less frightening. When adults argued in the background, he spoke louder, drowning out the noise with exaggerated battle cries or silly stories. When the nights grew cold and heavy, he shared his blanket. When Keanu felt invisible in his own home, Lucas made him feel seen. The two boys were different in personality, yet bound by the same unspoken truth. Their lives made more sense together. But as the memories unfolded, they carried an undercurrent of tension. Keanu remembered the house growing unpredictable as the days grew shorter. He remembered flashes of anger from adults' muffled sobs behind thin walls and the heavy footsteps that made him freeze in place. Lucas always sensed when things were shifting in the wrong direction. He would appear at the porch steps before Keanu even called for him, ready to distract him with a new story or drag him into another adventure of their own making. One night stood out etched in his memory, even though the details were blurred. He remembered the air being unusually warm for the season. He remembered Lucas grabbing his hand and whispering that they should go outside for a while. They slipped out through the back door, tiptoeing past creaking floorboards and down the steps into the backyard. Lucas held their wooden swords tucked under his arm, insisting they must protect their imaginary kingdom before darkness swallowed it. They played for a while under the dim glow of the streetlight, pretending to fight shadows creeping along the fence. They laughed, breathless, trying to ignore the tense voices drifting from inside the house. Then the laughter faded. A loud crash echoed from somewhere behind them. Lucas stopped mid-swing, his body suddenly rigid. The shouting grew sharper, louder. Something heavy hit the floor. A moment later, smoke seeped from the corner of the back window, thin at first, then thicker. Keanu remembered Lucas turning to him with wide, urgent eyes. He grabbed his hand tighter than usual and pulled him toward the back door. But just as they reached the steps, everything blurred. His memory broke apart, replaced by a single, overwhelming sensation: fear. The kind that sinks into the bones and freezes the body. From that moment on, everything went dark. He could never remember what happened next, and now sitting in Mrs. Alvarez's warm dining room, he felt the ache of that missing memory as if it had been waiting for this moment to be acknowledged. The more Keanu searched his memory, the more he realized that the blank space after that moment had shaped him without his knowing. It wasn't just a forgotten fragment of childhood. It was a missing piece that influenced the way he carried himself, the way he protected others, the way he kept his emotions close. Something traumatic had sealed that night away, leaving him with only a few fleeting images and the echo of Lucas's hand gripping his. He pressed his eyes shut, forcing himself to stay inside the memory instead of pulling away from it. He remembered the faint heat against his skin, the distant roar of something consuming the air, the sound of wood cracking. Then faintly, a strong arm wrapping around his chest. He didn't remember the face attached to it, but he remembered the feeling. Someone had lifted him, carried him through the smoke, shielding him with their own body. He later understood that person must have been Mr. Petrov. But Lucas was the last face he remembered clearly before everything went black. The loss of that memory made Keanu's heart ache. Lucas had never been afraid of anything. He was the one who ran toward danger when others ran away. The kind of boy who would step in front of a bully, defend a younger kid, or check on a friend whose house felt unsafe. If anyone would have acted that night, it would have been Lucas. A new realization pressed itself into Keanu's mind. The sudden disappearance of Lucas and his mother after that night had never been explained to him. He remembered waking up somewhere unfamiliar, wrapped in a blanket that didn't belong to him. He remembered Mrs. Alvarez comforting him, telling him everything was going to be all right. He remembered being told he would be staying somewhere else for a while, and after that, nothing. Lucas was simply gone. No goodbye, no explanation. His chest tightened as he opened his eyes again. He looked down at the drawing of the two boys with wooden swords, their smiles bright and full of promise. It struck him how cruel it was that such innocent faces could carry such heavy stories. He wondered what Lucas had seen that night, what he had done, what consequences he might have faced. and why no one had ever told him the truth. Mrs. Alvarez must have sensed the storm building inside him. She placed a gentle hand on the table beside his. She said the blank space in his memory wasn't an accident. Some things were too painful for a child to hold on to. Some truths were too heavy, and some acts of bravery left scars no one could see. Keanu exhaled slowly, the realization settling into him like a weight he was finally strong enough to carry. He began to suspect something he had never dared to consider. Lucas hadn't just been his friend. Lucas had saved him from something terrible. And now, decades later, the truth was finally coming back to him. The walk back to the old house felt heavier than before. The cold evening air brushed against Keanu's face, but his thoughts were far away, tangled in the memories Mrs. Alvarez had helped uncover. Every step seemed to draw him deeper into the past, into the parts of his childhood he had spent a lifetime keeping at a distance. When he reached the porch again, the sun had dipped low behind the houses, casting long shadows across the warped boards. The house stood quiet, as if waiting for him. Inside, the air felt even colder. The silence wrapped around him like a thin, brittle layer of ice. He walked through the living room slowly, taking in the faint remnants of the world he once knew. The height marks on the doorframe, the old toy car, the scribbles on the wall. They no longer felt like random pieces of childhood. They felt like markers in a story he had only half remembered. A story that was now demanding to be seen in full. He moved toward the center of the room where the loose floorboard waited. His heart beat steadily, but each beat felt deeper, heavier. The memory of Lucas, clearer now than it had been in decades, followed him like a presence standing just behind his shoulder. He knelt down, brushing away the thin layer of dust from the raised board. His fingers lingered at the edge for a moment, as if giving himself one last chance to hesitate. Then he lifted it. The hollow beneath the floor opened like a small wooden mouth, dark at first, until the glow of the late afternoon light slid across its contents. Inside were several objects, arranged carefully, not thrown in as if forgotten, but placed with intention. Each item rested as though it carried meaning, and together they formed a silent message waiting for the right moment to be read. The first thing he saw was a stack of Polaroids, their white borders yellowed at the edges. He reached in and picked them up. The top photograph showed two boys standing side by side on the front porch, wooden swords raised triumphantly. Lucas's grin was wide and fearless. Keanu's smile was smaller, softer, but filled with trust. He flipped to the next photo. The boys sitting under the maple tree knees, scraped faces flushed from play. Another captured them mid-laugh. Another holding toy shields made from cardboard. Photo after photo, evidence of a bond stronger than he had allowed himself to remember. His throat tightened. These were moments of his life he thought had disappeared forever, and someone had kept them safe. Keanu set the Polaroids beside him on the worn floor, his fingers lingering on the last image as if afraid it might fade the moment he looked away. He drew in a shaky breath, then reached back into the hollow space. His hand brushed against something familiar in shape, but lighter, almost fragile. When he lifted it into the light, his chest constricted. It was the small wooden sword he and Lucas had carved together. The wood had aged, turning a soft, muted brown. The hilt was wrapped in old string, frayed but intact. He remembered the day they made it. Lucas had insisted they needed better weapons for their battles, something real knights would carry. They spent an entire weekend searching for the right piece of wood behind the house, then borrowed a dull carving knife from Lucas's mother. Keanu remembered their small hands working awkwardly, passing the knife, carefully between them, sanding the edges with scraps of old newspaper until the sword felt just right. Holding it now, he was struck by how small it was, how small they were, how much courage Lucas had carried in such a young body. He placed the sword gently beside the photographs, as if laying down a relic of a lost era. The hollow still held more. He reached in again, fingers brushing against folded paper. This one felt delicate, worn thin by time. He pulled it out slowly, as if afraid it would tear. A letter. Folded twice, edges uneven, smudged with what looked like dirt and possibly tears. The handwriting on the outside stopped him cold. He recognized it instantly. The same uneven, determined scrawl Lucas had used when labeling their cardboard shields or writing their names on chalkboard games. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The message was short, simple, but it struck with the force of a blow. Keanu, if you're reading this someday, please come find me. I didn't leave because I wanted to. The words blurred for a moment as emotion tightened behind his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to steady his breathing. The letter felt like a cry from the past, a voice reaching across decades, cutting through all the missing years. Lucas hadn't vanished willingly. Something had taken him away, something neither of them had control over. Keanu stared at the paper, feeling the weight of 40 years collapse into this one frozen moment. He reached back into the hollow heart pounding, knowing there was still one more object, the torn piece of a police report. Keanu lifted the final object from the hollow, a torn fragment of an old police report, yellowed and brittle. Only a few lines were visible, but they were enough. 2 minors present, one removed from the home for safety, the other transported unconscious. His stomach tightened as the missing pieces locked into place. Lucas hadn't abandoned him. He had been taken, and whatever happened that night had stolen them from each other long before either boy understood why. Keanu sat on the cold floor, the letter in one hand and the wooden sword beside him, trembling at a truth buried for decades. Keanu stayed on the floor of the abandoned house for a long moment, letting the truth settle into him. The letter, the torn police report, the wooden sword, they felt like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed. When he finally pushed himself to his feet, his legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in some irreversible way. He knew he needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them. He stepped outside into the cold air, the sky dimming as evening approached. Mrs. Alvarez was still on her porch, watching him with a quiet sorrow that made his chest tighten. She seemed to understand without a word that he had found everything hidden beneath the floorboard. She opened her front door and motioned for him to come in, her expression gentle but heavy. Inside her warm living room, Keanu held the folded letter in his hand, unable to look away from Lucas's handwriting. He finally asked the question that had been clawing at him since the moment he opened it. What happened to Lucas? The silence that followed was long and fragile. Mrs. Alvarez sat at her dining table, her fingers curled around a warm mug she hadn't yet taken a sip from. She looked down her shoulders, sagging slightly, as though the years were suddenly too heavy to carry. When she lifted her eyes again, they were shimmering with emotion. She told him that after the night of the incident, the night of the fire, the shouting, the danger, everything changed for Lucas and his mother. They didn't just move away, they disappeared. Gone before sunrise the next day. Their apartment was emptied out in hours. No forwarding address, no goodbyes, no explanation. Adults whispered that maybe Lucas's mother had taken him to start over somewhere safer. Others feared the truth was darker, but no one really knew. Keanu listened in stillness, the ache inside him growing sharper. Lucas had vanished from his life not because he drifted away, but because something had forced his world to collapse. Mrs. Alvarez wiped her eyes gently, then stood and moved toward a drawer in her hallway. She said she had one more thing to show him. Mrs. Alvarez returned with a small box, the kind used to hold letters or keepsakes too important to lose. She set it on the table, her hands lingering on the lid for a moment before opening it. Inside were old envelopes, notes, and scraps of paper she had collected over the years. She sifted through them slowly until she found a thin card bordered in blue. She held it as though it were as fragile as dry leaves. She explained that Lucas's mother, Elena, had visited her late one evening a few days before the incident. She looked exhausted, frightened, and overwhelmed. She asked Mrs. Alvarez to keep a record of an address in case something happened and she couldn't return. She didn't say why, only that she was preparing for the possibility of leaving suddenly. Mrs. Alvarez never understood the full story, only that Elena loved her son fiercely and wanted him somewhere safer if trouble came. She handed the card to Keanu. The handwriting was hurried but clear. A name, a street, a building number, Vancouver. For a moment, Keanu couldn't breathe. The distance between Toronto and Vancouver felt enormous, but the idea that Lucas might have ended up there stirred something fierce inside him. A possibility, a lifeline, a direction after decades of emptiness. His fingers tightened around the card as if anchoring himself to it. Mrs. Alvarez watched him closely, her voice soft with sympathy. She said she checked the address once many years ago, but no one answered when she knocked. She suspected they moved again shortly after arriving. Elena seemed to be always running from something she never fully explained. But the address was the last trace she ever had of them. Keanu looked down at the card, his chest heavy with gratitude and grief. This was more than a clue. It was the closest he had ever been to finding Lucas since the day they were torn apart. He thought about the letter hidden under the floorboard, the plea written by a frightened boy who never meant to leave him behind. He folded the card carefully and placed it in his pocket. The decision formed in him instantly, without hesitation. He would search. He would follow this path. He owed Lucas that much. Mrs. Alvarez took a slow breath and sat back down, as though relieved to finally share what she had held onto for so long. The room felt still around them, the soft hum of her old refrigerator, the only sound between the quiet weight of their conversation. Keanu looked at the faded Vancouver address again, running his thumb over the rough paper. It felt like a bridge, tying the fragile past to the present moment. She told him that after Lucas and his mother vanished, the neighborhood tried to move on, but for her, the loss was personal. She had watched over both boys in their early years, seen their bond strengthen, seen how Lucas protected him when adults failed too. When they disappeared, it left a hole she never forgot. She kept the address, hoping one day she might hear from them or be able to pass it along to someone who needed it. Keanu listened with an ache he couldn't fully articulate. Every memory of Lucas now carried a sharper edge. The laughter, the wooden swords, the bravery of a small boy who faced the world like a shield for those he loved. He thought of the letter found beneath the floorboards, the words that had lived in silence for decades. If you're reading this someday, please come find me. I didn't leave because I wanted to. The plea echoed inside him with a force that tightened his throat. Lucas had been taken from him, taken from their life, taken from the one place where their friendship offered them safety, and he had faced it alone. The realization stirred something fierce and protective within Keanu, something he thought he'd outgrown, but now recognized as a piece of his childhood, returning with purpose. He looked up at Mrs. Alvarez with a steady calm, the kind born from clarity rather than certainty. He said he would go to Vancouver. He said he needed to know what happened, whether Lucas was still alive, and if so, where the years had carried him. Mrs. Alvarez nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, pride and sorrow mingling in her expression. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, telling him she believed he was doing the right thing. She had always hoped someone would look for Lucas, someone who cared enough to follow the fragile trail left behind. Keanu stood, feeling the weight of the moment settle into him like a promise he could no longer ignore. He looked once more at the card, then placed it safely in his jacket pocket. He whispered the words quietly, but with unwavering certainty. He would find him. Keanu left Toronto the next morning before the sun had fully risen, carrying only a small bag, the Vancouver address, and the memories that had resurfaced with painful clarity. The highway stretched before him in long silver lines winding through early morning fog that clung to the fields and forests like a blanket of ghosts from yesterday. As the city faded behind him, he felt the strange mixture of heaviness and purpose settle deeper in his chest. He was driving not just toward a destination, but toward a truth that had been waiting more than 40 years. The further he drove, the more the landscape changed. Small towns appeared along the route, places where families struggled quietly, where communities in the 1970s had often been segregated, where children like Lucas faced challenges most adults could barely comprehend. Keanu stopped in several of them, guided by instinct more than certainty. He walked through old neighborhoods, studying buildings that had long been abandoned or turned into community centers. He searched for any record of families who might have moved abruptly in the weeks after the incident. At each stop, he asked about Lucas, the same description every time. A mixed-race boy with warm brown skin and bright eyes, braver than he should have been, loud but in the way children use their voices to shield others from hurt. More than once, someone paused, as if searching through decades of memories. A few older residents nodded slowly and said they remembered children like him, boys who stuck up for others, who refused to back down, who carried too much courage for their age. But no one remembered exactly where Lucas had gone. Keanu didn't grow discouraged, but each answer left him with the same aching question. How could a boy like Lucas vanish so completely? How could someone with so much presence slip through the cracks of a country this large? The lack of answers only clarified the reality of his journey. He wasn't just trying to locate a friend. He was chasing a shadow across time, across provinces, across the remnants of a childhood, interrupted before either boy had the chance to understand it. He kept driving west, trusting that the road itself would reveal the next step. He wasn't turning back. By the time Keanu crossed into northern Ontario, the landscape had widened into long stretches of rock formations, frozen lakes, and towering evergreens. The winter air pressed heavily against the car windows, but inside his focus stayed sharp. At every town he passed through, he stopped at community centers, old churches, and shelters, any place where record books or living memory might hold a clue about families who fled domestic turmoil in the late 1970s. Some places had handwritten entries in dusty binders, others had digitalized archives from the past few decades. In each location, he searched with quiet determination, his childhood friend's face growing clearer in his memory with every mile. Lucas laughing beneath the maple tree, Lucas gripping his wooden sword like a warrior, Lucas grabbing his hand the night the smoke crawled across the ceiling. At a small shelter near Thunder Bay, an elderly volunteer paused when Keanu described the boy he was searching for. She leaned back in her chair, narrowing her eyes as if sifting through memories buried beneath years of helping children who moved in and out of difficult homes. She couldn't recall a boy named Lucas, but she remembered kids who had shown similar resilience, children who defended others, children who vanished suddenly when their parents left town with little warning. Keanu listened closely as she described how common it had been back then for single mothers under pressure to disappear overnight. Many feared losing their children to the system. Many fled before anyone could intervene. Her words added a layer of understanding to Lucas's story. His mother had not been careless. She had been desperate to protect him from something too heavy to speak about publicly. In Winnipeg, Keanu visited a community archive staffed by a retired social worker who had worked with at-risk youth in the late 1970s. She studied the torn scrap of the police report he carried. She remembered many cases like it, children placed into temporary custody after violent events, then relocated far away for their safety. She couldn't confirm Lucas's name, but she recognized the pattern immediately. She looked at Keanu with quiet compassion and told him something he already knew deep down. Children like Lucas rarely got the choice to stay or say goodbye. They were moved hidden, sometimes renamed all in the name of safety. The truth settled into Keanu's chest like a cold weight. He was getting closer, but he was also chasing a life rewritten by fear and necessity. Keanu continued west until the mountains began rising like dark silhouettes against the sky. Vancouver was still hours away, but he felt the pull of it long before he reached the coast. Every town he visited along the way echoed the same truth. People remembered boys like Lucas, brave, protective, quick to shield others before themselves, but no one knew where life had taken him. The absence of clear answers sharpened Keanu's resolve rather than weakening it. He understood now that Lucas had lived through a kind of chaos that swallowed families whole. He also understood something deeper. Lucas had not only been taken from his childhood home, he had been forced into a different life entirely without the stability or support most children needed to survive. As the Pacific air finally touched his lungs, Keanu felt the emotional weight of the journey settle inside him. The Vancouver skyline glimmered through a curtain of mist, distant, yet full of unspoken promise. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the wooden sword they once carved together. Its surface was worn smooth with age, but the memories pulsed through it, like a heartbeat. He whispered a quiet vow to the boy who once saved him. He would not leave this city without answers. Vancouver's humid coastal air clung to Keanu's skin as he walked into a small community archive, tucked behind an aging brick library. The building felt forgotten by the city around it, but inside, rows of metal filing cabinets held decades of stories, losses, and names that had slipped through the cracks of the system. Keanu approached the front desk where an elderly woman with silver hair tied neatly in a bun sorted through papers with slow, practiced movements. He gave her Lucas's full name. The room seemed to pause for a breath. She lifted her eyes. Something in them flickered with recognition, the kind that surfaces only when a memory carries weight. She asked him to wait while she checked older files stored in the back. Her footsteps echoed down a narrow hallway, leaving Keanu alone with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. He gripped the wooden sword in his jacket pocket, feeling its familiar shape press against his palm. After several minutes, the woman returned, holding a thin folder that looked as fragile as tissue. She placed it on the table and opened it carefully. She explained that many records from the late 1970s were incomplete, but some were preserved through handwritten notes from caseworkers who refused to let certain children disappear entirely. One of those workers, she said, had written Lucas's name multiple times. Keanu leaned in as she read aloud the key details. Lucas had been placed into protective custody after a domestic emergency involving his mother and her violent partner. The report described a dangerous environment full of shouting threats and instability. The caseworker who intervened believed Lucas had shielded another child that night. The official description simply noted another minor present, but Keanu knew who that child had been. The woman explained that Lucas's mother entered treatment shortly afterward, but her addiction and living situation made reunification impossible. Lucas spent the next several years moving between foster family shelters and temporary care homes. The system tried to keep him in British Columbia, but overcrowded facilities often pushed children toward other provinces. Then she pointed to one final note in the file, a transfer to Alberta. Lucas had been moved to Calgary, and according to one last update, he had grown into a tradesman, a carpenter. Keanu felt a rush of heat in his chest as the woman repeated the word Calgary. The name of the city settled in his mind with a quiet finality, as though the long, winding trail of scattered memories and broken records had finally aligned into a single direction. Calgary was far from where Lucas started, far from the childhood they once shared, but it was a place, a real place. And for the first time since uncovering the raised floorboard, Keanu felt the faint but steady spark of certainty. The woman continued reading, her voice soft but steady. She explained that children like Lucas often carried invisible scars into adulthood. Many found solace in physical work because it grounded them, gave them purpose, gave them something they could hold. Carpentry was common among former youth in care. It offered structure. It offered creation instead of chaos. It offered a way to build something solid after years of instability. Every detail she shared painted a clearer picture of the man Lucas might have become. She flipped to a final note handwritten in blue ink. It mentioned a community outreach program in Calgary that helped older teens transition into independent living. The record didn't list personal details, confidentiality rules, protected identities, but it confirmed Lucas had completed the program and later apprenticed under a local contractor. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment and let the information sink in. After years of silence, after decades of wondering, after entire chapters of life had passed them both, Lucas had survived. He had grown. He had found work that reflected the fearlessness he carried as a boy with a wooden sword. Keanu felt a swell of emotion rise unexpectedly. Gratitude, relief, a faint grief for the lost years neither of them could reclaim. but stronger than all of it was a growing sense of determination. The woman reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a weathered card with faded ink. It carried the name of the Calgary contractor who once supervised Lucas's apprenticeship. She explained that the contractor had retired recently, but she believed he still lived at the address printed on the card. She placed it gently into Keanu's hand. This was the first concrete link to Lucas's adult life. For the first time, Keanu had an address. Keanu stepped outside the archive with the address held tightly in his hand. The cool Vancouver air moved around him sharper now, as if urging him forward. For the first time, the search no longer felt like wandering through shadows. He had a real path, a real connection, a real chance to find the boy who once saved his life. He looked down at the wooden sword in his jacket, feeling its history pulse against his palm. Then he whispered a quiet promise to the friend who had carried him through the fire. He was going to Calgary. The drive into Calgary carried a different kind of weight. Keanu felt it in the silence of the car, in the steady thrum of the tires against the road, in the quiet anticipation that had been building ever since the social worker handed him the small weathered card. The day was cold, the kind where sunlight glinted off the frost in the air, turning the edges of the city into a blur of pale gold and silver. As he reached the outskirts, the buildings grew smaller, replaced by wide lots, old barns, and industrial sheds that had seen decades of work. The woodworking shop wasn't flashy. A simple structure with faded paint, wide doors, and the smell of fresh sawdust drifting into the cold air. Keanu parked his car and stepped out slowly. The ground crunched under his boots. His pulse pressed hard against his ribs, steady but strong. He approached the shop, guided more by instinct than certainty, and stepped inside. Warmth hit him instantly. The scent of cedar and old pine filled the space. Wooden furniture in various stages of completion lined the walls, a half-finished table, carved bedposts, chair legs shaped with precision. Sunlight pushed through the dusty windows, casting long beams across the floor. In the center of the shop, a man worked quietly with his back turned. Keanu stopped. The man was tall, with strong shoulders and graying curls pulled loosely away from his face. His warm brown skin caught the soft light, revealing small scars along his forearm, the kind that came from years of tools slipping or wood splintering. He stood over a chair leg, carving delicate lines with slow, practiced movement. Keanu knew instantly the shape of the shoulders, the steady posture, the quiet strength. It was the same energy that once belonged to a boy who held a wooden sword like a guardian, a boy who protected without hesitation, a boy who vanished one night without goodbye. He whispered the name in his mind before he dared to say it aloud. Lucas. At that exact moment, the man turned. Their eyes met. The chisel slipped from Lucas's hand and hit the floor. For a long moment, neither man moved. The sound of the dropped chisel echoed across the shop, then faded into a heavy stillness. Lucas stared at Keanu as though he were looking at a memory made real, a figure carved out of the past and placed suddenly in front of him. His eyes softened, first widening with disbelief, then tightening with an emotion that carried years of silence and unanswered questions. Keanu took a small step closer. He didn't speak at first. He let the moment breathe, let Lucas see him not as the actor the world knew, but as the boy he once stood beside. The boy who hid behind him during shouting nights. The boy who laughed with him in the dirt. The boy he dragged out of danger one terrible evening that neither had ever spoken about since. Lucas's chest rose in a sharp breath, as if holding back a wave he didn't know how to release. His hands trembled slightly, and he wiped them on his work apron, leaving faint streaks of dust on the fabric. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, as though testing whether the ground beneath him was steady enough to carry the weight of what was happening. Keanu felt the years compress between them. 4 decades of separation folded into a single glance. He saw in Lucas's face the traces of the child. He remembered the stubborn strength, the fierce loyalty, the spark of bravery that had once pulled him through the smoke of a burning hallway. But now those traits were layered with lines of fatigue, resilience, and a quiet maturity, carved by a lifetime spent building his future piece by piece. Lucas finally whispered Keanu's name, barely audible, but filled with a depth that struck straight through the years between them. Emotion tightened Keanu's throat. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. He saw Lucas's eyes glisten, and for a moment both men simply stood there, breathing in the reality of a reunion neither had imagined possible. Lucas reached out with a hesitant hand as if afraid the moment might collapse. Keanu stepped into the gesture without hesitation, meeting it with steady warmth. Two boys, now men, finally stood in the same room again. The night that split their lives apart had not taken everything. Not anymore. Lucas guided Keanu toward a small workbench near the window, the one spot in the shop where the afternoon light fell in a warm, steady line. They sat without speaking at first. The silence between them wasn't empty. It carried years of questions, years of wondering, years of unspoken guilt and gratitude. Lucas studied Keanu's face with a mix of relief and disbelief, as though he were memorizing details he never expected to see again. Keanu saw the same thing in him, the strength, the warmth, the quiet resilience of a man who had survived more than he ever should have as a child. He reached into his jacket and placed the wooden sword gently on the workbench between them. Lucas's breath caught. His fingers hovered above it, trembling, before finally resting on the worn handle they once carved together. The years folded even tighter. Lucas looked up, eyes wet. He didn't need to ask how Keanu found him. The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that the boy he protected had come back. What mattered was that someone remembered him. Someone cared enough to search the entire country to find him. For the first time since that night, neither of them felt alone. The light in the woodworking shop softened as the afternoon slowly crossed into evening. Dust floated gently in the beams from the windows, creating a quiet, almost sacred space around the two men. Lucas still held the wooden sword in his hands, turning it slowly, studying the grooves they carved as children. Keanu waited. He sensed something building inside Lucas, something long buried that had been waiting for a moment like this. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, shaped by years of holding the truth alone. He said he remembered every detail of that night with absolute clarity, not because he wanted to, but because it had followed him into every chapter of his life. He explained that Keanu's biological father came home drunk that evening. More drunk than usual, there had been shouting in the hallway, glass-breaking footsteps stumbling. Lucas and Keanu had been playing with their wooden swords earlier that night, but Lucas had taken his friend into the hallway when the yelling grew louder. He said Keanu was scared. He said he was too, but someone had to act like the brave one. Then Lucas paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. A fire had started in the kitchen. It spread faster than either boy understood. Smoke filled the house. Adults pushed past each other in panic. Someone knocked over a chair. Someone screamed. In the chaos, Keanu was separated from Lucas. He remembered seeing flames spreading across the doorway, trapping Keanu behind a wall of smoke. Lucas's hands tightened around the wooden sword as he told the rest. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He ran straight into the smoke to find Keanu. He crawled under the heat, calling his friend's name, until he saw Keanu collapsed near the wall. He grabbed him under the arms and dragged him out, coughing, choking, fighting against the burning air. By the time they reached the front step, police officers and neighbors were swarming the yard. Lucas remembered collapsing onto the grass, barely breathing, still clinging to Keanu's arm. And that was when everything changed, because the police didn't take Lucas back inside. They took him away. Lucas said the memory of that moment never faded. The flashing red and blue lights, the cold air hitting his smoke-burned skin, the firm hands lifting him away from the front yard while he kept trying to look back at Keanu, trying to make sure he was alive. He remembered shouting that he didn't want to leave. He remembered reaching for his mother, but she was already surrounded by officers yelling in confusion, overwhelmed by the chaos. The authorities separated them quickly, too quickly for him to understand. Lucas told Keanu that one officer kept repeating the same thing. It wasn't safe for him to return. Not that night. Maybe not ever. He was placed in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like detergent and metal, watching the only home he had known blur behind streaked windows. He didn't know if Keanu had survived. He didn't know if anyone would tell him. He only knew he had pulled his friend out of the fire and then lost everything familiar in the same breath. He said he blamed himself for years. He thought maybe if he hadn't run inside, the adults wouldn't have panicked. Maybe if he hadn't yelled for help, the officers wouldn't have intervened so forcefully. Maybe if he hadn't been there at all, none of it would have spiraled into the nightmare that shattered 2 families in one night. Lucas admitted he carried that belief all through foster homes, through shelters, through years of drifting. He learned early not to ask too many questions. Every time he tried, he was told the case was confidential. He grew up believing he made everything worse. Keanu felt each word settle in his chest with a weight he had never known. He saw the pain in Lucas's eyes, a pain shaped not only by fear and loss, but by years of believing he was the cause rather than the victim. He wanted to speak, but Lucas wasn't finished. There was more to unravel. Lucas said the system moved him so quickly, he never had a chance to say goodbye. His mother was sent to treatment. Her violent partner faced charges. And Lucas was left with the single memory that had guided his entire childhood, pulling Keanu from the fire, then it being taken as though he had done something wrong. He looked down at his hands as he finished. That was the night he lost his childhood. Keanu felt the words carve through him, each one opening a space he had never realized existed. The guilt, the sacrifice, the silence that followed both of them into adulthood. He reached across the workbench and placed a steady hand on Lucas's arm. The gesture held everything he couldn't say fast enough: gratitude, grief, a recognition 4 decades overdue. Lucas finally lifted his eyes. The pain in them was still there, but now it carried something else: relief. He said he had spent years believing that saving Keanu somehow caused the rest of the night to collapse. He believed the officers took him away because he interfered, because he shouted too loud, because he rushed into danger, because he was trouble. Keanu shook his head slowly. He told Lucas the truth he had waited his whole life to understand. Lucas didn't make things worse. He saved him. He saved a child who couldn't save himself. And in doing so, he lost the childhood he deserved. The words broke something open in both of them. Lucas's breath shuddered. Tears finally rose, and Keanu, quiet, steady, overwhelmed, let his own fall in return. The quiet in the woodworking shop lingered even after their tears had dried. Something had shifted between them, something deep and long overdue. Lucas wiped his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed at first, then letting go of the instinct to hide his emotions. Keanu stayed beside him, steady and unhurried, giving him room to breathe through the weight of the moment. When Lucas finally stood, his posture seemed lighter, as though speaking the truth had lifted a burden he had carried for most of his life. He placed the wooden sword gently back on the workbench, tracing its grooves one last time before facing Keanu again. There was a question in his eyes, a quiet uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure what came next or whether he deserved anything more than the life he had carved out in silence. Keanu told him there was something they needed to do, something that might hurt, but something that mattered. He suggested they return to Toronto together. He explained that the house where everything happened still held pieces of their past, pieces Lucas deserved to reclaim. Lucas looked away, hesitating. The thought of going back frightened him in a way few things did. He had spent decades trying to outrun the ghosts of that night. Returning to the source felt like facing a fire for the second time. But Keanu didn't rush him. He simply waited, letting Lucas decide in his own time. After a long silence, Lucas exhaled slowly, shoulders trembling with the weight of the decision. He said he didn't know if he could face the place that took so much from him, but he also said he didn't want to let fear write the last chapter of their story, especially now that he knew he wasn't alone. The decision settled between them like a fragile but determined spark. Lucas nodded. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, grounding him with steady warmth. They locked the shop together, stepping out into the cold air of early evening. The sky above Calgary stretched wide and pale, as if offering a quiet blessing for the journey ahead. They would return to Toronto. Not as broken boys separated by tragedy, but as men ready to reclaim the truth that bound them. They left Calgary before sunrise 2 days later, traveling quietly along the long stretch of highway that carried them east. The early light painted the horizon in soft shades of gold and blue, giving the world a calmness that neither had felt in years. Lucas sat in the passenger seat, hands folded loosely in his lap, eyes focused on the distant fields rolling past them. He wasn't tense, but he wasn't at ease either. He was preparing himself for something he had avoided his entire adult life. Keanu kept the drive steady and unhurried. He didn't want to overwhelm him. Every so often, Lucas glanced at him, as if making sure this journey was real, as if confirming that someone truly wanted to walk beside him through the memories he had once carried alone. Their conversations drifted in and out. Sometimes they spoke about childhood moments they both remembered. Other times, they sat in shared silence, letting the road carry their thoughts without forcing anything. As they crossed back into Ontario, Lucas grew quieter. His breathing slowed, his fingers tapping gently against the side of his leg. Keanu understood without asking. Returning to Toronto wasn't just about confronting a memory. It was about stepping back into the space where his life had been split open. A place where he was taken from his mother, from his friend, from the only sense of safety he had ever known. When the familiar skyline appeared in the distance, Lucas looked down at his hands. He said it felt strange to come back as a man when he left as a frightened boy. He said he wasn't sure what he would feel when they reached the old house. Keanu told him he didn't need to feel anything specific. He only needed to be present. Lucas took a steady breath and nodded. They pulled onto the old street in the late afternoon. The neighborhood had aged, but the bones of it remained the same. The cracked sidewalks, the leaning fence posts, the maple tree Lucas once climbed. When the car slowed in front of the abandoned house, Lucas froze. He stared at it as though trying to match the decaying structure to the place he remembered, in fragments. Keanu turned off the engine and waited. Lucas didn't move right away, but after a long moment, he opened the door. He was ready, even if it scared him. Lucas hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside the wooden threshold, creaking under his weight. The air in the house was still carrying the faint smell of dust and old memories. He walked slowly through the narrow hallway, his eyes drifting across the faded scribbles on the wall and the height marks carved into the doorframe. He stopped in front of his own name, scratched lightly beside Keanu's, the handwriting small and determined. Keanu led him into the room where the raised floorboard waited. Lucas knelt down, hands trembling as he lifted it. When he saw the wooden sword lying beneath, the breath left his lungs. He touched it gently, fingers tracing the familiar grooves, and his shoulders began to shake. He whispered something under his breath, a soft sound of grief and release woven together. Keanu knelt beside him, steady and present. He told Lucas he hadn't lost his childhood. He had protected someone else's. He had saved a life when he was barely more than a child himself. Lucas covered his face with his hands, tears spilling freely, no longer held back by years of silence. For the first time in decades, the house felt warmer. 2 boys, now men, had finally come home together. The next morning arrived quietly, with sunlight breaking through thin clouds and casting a soft glow across the old Toronto street. Lucas and Keanu stood outside the childhood home, both men taking in the worn siding, the sagging porch, and the faded paint that had endured too many unkind seasons. The house looked tired, but in its bones it still held the echoes of 2 childhoods intertwined by both joy and tragedy. Keanu had made his decision the night before. The house would no longer sit abandoned, trapped in its past. Instead, it would become something new, something healing. He finalized the purchase that morning, signing the paperwork with a sense of purpose that ran deeper than any film role or public commitment. This wasn't about nostalgia. It was about rewriting the meaning of the place that had shaped both of their lives. When Lucas heard what Keanu intended to do with the house, he stood still for a long moment, overwhelmed. Keanu explained that he didn't want to turn it into a mansion or a museum. He wanted it to become a warm community home for foster youth. A place where children facing the same instability Lucas endured could feel safe. A place built on the strength and sacrifice Lucas had carried all those years. Lucas looked at the house again, seeing it differently now, not as the source of his pain, but as a chance to transform it into something good. Within days, a small restoration crew arrived. They approached the project with respect, knowing the home held history worth protecting. Walls were repaired, windows replaced, and cracked foundations secured. But there were parts of the house that Keanu insisted he and Lucas rebuild themselves. The porch was the first. They spent the early afternoon removing rotten boards and measuring new planks. Lucas guided the process with his carpenter's hands, moving with confidence and skill. Keanu followed his lead, handing him tools, steadying beams, and learning the rhythm of the work. At times, they fell into laughter, natural, easy, reminiscent of boys building forts again. The sound kept the air warm, even as the wind picked up. Mrs. Alvarez watched from her porch before walking over with a tray of lemonade. Her eyes shimmered with tears she didn't bother to hide. What she witnessed was something she had prayed for her entire life. Lucas took the glass of lemonade with a small, grateful smile. The warmth in Mrs. Alvarez's eyes softened him in a way he hadn't expected. She had watched them as boys watched them vanish in separate directions, and now watched them return as men rebuilding something far larger than a porch. She told them she had prayed for healing even when she had no idea what healing might look like. Seeing them work side by side made her feel as though time itself had been repaired. Keanu and Lucas continued rebuilding long after she returned to her house. The sounds of hammering, sanding, and measuring filled the yard. Each board they fastened down seemed to carry symbolic weight. It wasn't just wood, it wasn't just construction. It was each of them laying down pieces of themselves, pieces that had been scattered by a night neither boy had ever chosen. Now those pieces were coming back together in the steady rhythm of rebuilding. As the hours passed, the porch began to transform from a sagging structure into a strong, welcoming entryway. Lucas worked with quiet focus, but every now and then he paused to look at the wood beneath his hands, as if absorbing the fact that he was shaping a place he once fled from. Keanu noticed each moment of hesitation and steadied the work around him, giving Lucas space to breathe through whatever surfaced in his memory. Later, when the sun dipped low, casting warm orange light across the neighborhood, Lucas stepped back to admire their progress. He wiped his forehead with the corner of his sleeve and exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. The porch looked sturdy, almost new, the kind of entryway that invited people inside rather than sending them away in fear. Keanu saw something shift in Lucas's expression, a mix of relief, pride, and a quiet recognition that healing wasn't something that happened all at once. Sometimes it came one board at a time, one nail at a time, one shared breath between old friends. Mrs. Alvarez peeked from her window again, unable to hide her smile. For the first time in decades, the house looked alive, and the men rebuilding it looked like they had finally begun reclaiming something they lost. As evening settled, Keanu and Lucas gathered the last of the tools and stepped back onto the freshly built porch. The boards were smooth beneath their boots, the railings sturdy, the craftsmanship simple but strong. Lucas brushed his hand along the new beams, a quiet pride settling into his expression. He said it felt strange to build something for the place that once broke him. But then he added that it felt even stranger to realize he no longer feared it. Keanu told him the house wasn't a symbol of pain anymore. It was a symbol of what both of them survived, and now it would become a place where other children could feel safe, not abandoned. Lucas looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if trying to understand why someone would go to such lengths for a childhood friend. Keanu didn't have to explain. He simply handed Lucas one of the new nails they hadn't used. Lucas turned it in his hand, realizing it meant something more than construction. It meant they were rebuilding from the inside out. Mrs. Alvarez returned with 2 more glasses of lemonade, her smile trembling as she watched them stand on the porch. No longer shadows of the past, but men who had learned how to reclaim it. Word traveled slowly, at first carried through whispers among caseworkers and community volunteers. A restored old house in Toronto. A safe place run quietly by two men who understood what it meant to grow up afraid. No signs, no banners, no publicity. Just an open door and a warm light glowing from the front porch. But soon, more and more teens in the foster system began showing up, each one carrying a story they were too young to carry. Keanu made sure the home felt calm the moment they walked in. Soft lighting, clean rooms, comfortable furniture, a kitchen stocked with food. He wanted the space to feel like the home he never had as a child, the one he wished Lucas could have had too. He reached out to local educators who ran after-school programs quietly, offering to fund tutoring sessions for kids who had fallen behind. He wanted them to experience stability, not the constant uncertainty he remembered from those early years. Lucas threw himself into the work with a sense of purpose Keanu had never seen in him before. He set up the workshop in the garage, lined the walls with donated tools, and built long wooden tables so the kids could learn safely. Every afternoon, he taught them how to sand, measure, carve, and create something with their own hands. The room often filled with the rhythm of saws and the excited voices of teens who realized they were capable of making something beautiful. Lucas watched them with a quiet pride, knowing that teaching them these skills was helping them find confidence he had once lost. The house was beginning to change lives one small moment at a time. By the second month, the house had become something more than a safe space. It became a meeting point for kids who had never felt seen before. Some arrived shy and closed off, barely speaking above a whisper. Others carried anger that came from years of instability. Keanu welcomed each one, gently remembering how it felt to stand on uncertain ground as a child. He listened more than he spoke, guiding them through conversations about school friendships and the heavy weight of growing up without steady support. Lucas noticed the transformation too. Some kids lingered after woodworking class just to talk. They asked him how he learned to carve, what kept him going through the hardest years, why he never gave up. Lucas answered honestly, sharing pieces of his own past without glorifying the struggle. He wanted them to know that broken beginnings did not define a whole life. One afternoon, a teenage boy stayed behind after class. He held a wooden sword he had sanded carefully, trying to recreate the one Lucas and Keanu had carved as children. His hand shook a little when he offered it to Lucas, asking if he had done it right. Lucas turned the piece over, slowly touched by the care poured into every grain. He told the boy it was perfect. The boy's shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. Moments like these made the house feel alive. Keanu often stood in the hallway listening to laughter rising from the workshop or voices drifting from the kitchen. He realized the home was becoming exactly what he had hoped for, a place where fear softened and new beginnings felt possible. Each day added another layer of healing for the kids and for the two men who once survived that same street. In the final room of the restored home, sunlight streamed through newly cleaned windows, casting warm light across the walls. Keanu had saved this room for last. It was small and quiet, tucked away in the back of the house, untouched since the day he first returned. Now it held shelves for books, a soft rug, and a simple wooden table that Lucas had built by hand. Keanu entered holding the Polaroid, the one of him and Lucas as boys standing side by side with their wooden swords. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but the emotion captured in that moment remained unmistakable. Two children who had survived more than anyone realized. Two souls tied together long before they understood the weight of that connection. He placed the Polaroid into a simple wooden frame Lucas carved, then set it on the wall above the table. The picture settled into place as if it had always belonged there. Lucas stepped beside him, silent but steady, his eyes soft with memory and gratitude. Together they stood in the room that symbolized everything they had reclaimed: the pain, the loss, the courage, and the bond that endured through it all. The home had become a sanctuary, and now so had they. The sky over Toronto shifted into deep shades of orange and violet as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Keanu sat on the newly rebuilt porch, the boards warm beneath him, even as the evening cooled. In his hands rested the wooden sword, the same simple creation two boys once carved together with more hope than skill. He turned it slowly, letting the sunset catch the worn grooves, feeling the weight of everything it had survived. For a long moment he simply breathed. The air around him held a quiet stillness, the kind that only arrives when a long journey reaches its final meaningful pause. Behind him, the restored house glowed softly, each room carrying the laughter footsteps and hesitant hopes of the teens who now found comfort within its walls. The once haunted space no longer echoed with the past. It carried new stories, new beginnings, new chances at safety. Keanu gazed across the yard with a calm, reflective expression. He thought about the child he once was trying to make sense of chaotic nights and shifting walls. He thought about Lucas, the boy who kept stepping in front of danger even when he didn't know what danger meant. Childhood had a way of hiding truth beneath instinct, and now, holding the wooden sword again, Keanu understood how much of his life had been shaped by a moment he barely remembered. He realized something else too. Everyone carries someone like Lucas somewhere in their memory. Someone who stood beside them at a time when they needed it most. Someone who shielded them quietly without expecting thanks. Someone whose influence stayed alive even when time pulled them in different directions. Sitting there in the fading light, Keanu felt the full meaning of that truth settle into him. Keanu leaned back against the porch railing and listened to the distant sounds of evening. A dog barking 2 houses over, a screen door closing somewhere down the street. The gentle hum of passing cars. Life was moving, shifting, continuing, and somehow it felt more precious now than it ever had when he was a child, living inside the chaos of this very home. He looked at the windows glowing softly behind him. Inside, Lucas was sweeping up wood shavings from an afternoon spent teaching a group of shy teenagers how to sand their first projects. The sound of their laughter still hovered in the air, faint but present, like an echo of a childhood neither he nor Lucas ever got to fully enjoy. Yet now, through rebuilding this place, they were giving that chance to others. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. The past didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a root, something painful but necessary that had grown into strength. He thought about how every child deserves someone who sees them, protects them, believes in them. For him, that person had been Lucas. For others, it might be a teacher, a neighbor, a relative, or even a stranger who showed kindness at the right moment. The wooden sword rested across his lap, warm from his hands. It was a reminder that even the smallest connection can shape the direction of an entire life. And sometimes, the people who save us never know they did. That thought stayed with him. It pushed him to breathe deeper, to sit a little straighter, to feel grateful for the long path that had carried him back here. The porch felt like the safest place in the world. As the last light faded, Keanu lifted the wooden sword and held it in front of him. The grain of the old wood caught the soft orange glow of the sky, and he felt a steady warmth drift through him. This wasn't just a childhood toy. It was proof that someone once stood beside him when the world felt too heavy. Proof that friendship could survive time, distance, and silence. He hoped everyone watching would feel that same truth. He hoped they would remember someone who shaped their early years, someone who defended them, someone who believed in them when they couldn't yet believe in themselves. He turned the wooden sword over in his hands one last time and spoke softly, almost like he was speaking to the child he used to be. If you're listening to this, I hope you take a moment to reach out to someone from your past, someone who mattered, someone who left a mark that never faded. Then he offered his final invitation to the audience. Who is one person from your childhood you wish you could thank today? And what story would you like to see next with Keanu Reeves? The night settled peacefully around him. The mission continued.